This episode, Sean and I speak with Morgan, Vice President at Venrock, based in downtown New York. Morgan's career spans the US Navy, NYPD, counterterrorism, and now venture capital, where she's helping build Venrock's growing national security and public safety investment practice. We talk about the realities of funding innovation in defence, why there's still no clear front door into the DoD, how founders can actually get on contract, and when it makes sense to partner with primes. If you're building, funding, or operating in the national security or public safety space, this one's a must listen. Let's dive in. Welcome to the briefing room. Whether you're in defence, investing into the future, or simply curious about how great ideas become reality, this is your mission briefing. Let's get started.
We're really excited to have Morgan join us because, as you heard in her background, she brings so many facets from the national security perspective. And now in finance, she's doing great things with Venrock. Venrock has been one of the founding dual-use entities really in this space through Nick and a few of the other folks supporting entities like the Defense Innovation Unit. And Morgan, for your perspective, I think the last time we talked, I did mention my affiliation with Beaton Zone as the U.S. venture partner. And Peter and Steve Baxter, who created the organization, I think are the tip of the spear with regards to bringing Australian sovereign defense capability, not only to the Australian Ministry of Defense, but also here to the Department of Defense. And it's really important for our two nation states to get this right. You know, we've actually had what we call mateship going back to 1918, when Australian commanders actually commanded U.S. troops in World War I. And so what we're trying to do here at Beaton Zone is to go ahead and build that Indo-PACOM collaboration between our two nations and finding members of the coalition of the willing, in which we actually include you in. And we're excited to actually have you be a part of this conversation. And so back over to you, Peter.
The questions are always going to be quite similar, even though we can sort of delve deep into what we both invest in, what we're looking for, certain trends. But from Australia's perspective, our aim usually is, or primarily, is to find the best defence technology companies to invest in who are looking to scale, and we take them straight to the States simply because of the size of the market. The customers are there, and that's our pathway. It's quite rare for Australian defence technology companies to have a great deal of success here just because of the size and the way that the Australian Department of Defence purchases, which is slow and often not at all. So hence our pathway to the States, and why we work with people like Sean and various other agencies, and our strength is in those connections and those partnerships and those relationships. So we do invest in those heavily and spend a lot of time going backwards and forwards, attending the conferences, meeting people, understanding what's required. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, even being a local as such, is this sort of the approach that you take as well in terms of relationship building with defence, internally, externally, with the various organisations to assist your portfolio companies?
It has to be, because it's entirely, until we totally get the flywheel going, it's almost entirely relationship driven. I hate to say that out loud because there are so many different organizations that have been set up to foster deeper relationships between the government side and the startup community, including with the investment community, and happy to talk about that a little bit. But I think one of the challenges has been there's no one place. There's no like front door for commercial companies, regardless of where you're coming from. If you're coming from Five Eyes Ally, part of the back and forth that we've had with AUKUS, it doesn't matter where you're coming from. Like, that front door still doesn't totally exist for every type of technology. And I think that's been a really big challenge, and part of why we also leverage the kind of relationship network.
Yeah. And internally, how do you build those relationships inside the various areas of defence? Is that through those personal connections, or do you work with, say, people like Sean who have been a part of various organisations and plug in that way? And is it still something you are still establishing? Like, you've been involved for a little while now, but obviously it's still an active intention to go and seek out those connections.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of organizations that do work with the venture community pretty well. And so I think it's different. It's a different motion if you're talking about relationships that are getting generated with the venture side versus with our portfolio companies, because I think, one of the challenging things that we bump up against on the portfolio company side is you've got to go through a process. You are still a potential contractor to the government. There's still rules of the road as it relates to who within government can share what types of information with leadership teams or product teams across some of these non-traditional. So I think on the venture side, we leverage a variety of different organizations in the community, the DIUs of the world, the IncuTels of the world. There are a couple of services that do a really nice job of creating really strong venture capital ecosystems. The Army and the Navy in particular, I think, have done a really nice job on that front. So there's enough of a network of people who you can kind of phone a friend to and say, I'm interested in, or I have a company in X area, who should they be talking to? Because you need sort of the Rosetta Stone that helps you figure out what is the right pathway for every different company. And I think venture can play that intermediary role because we have less restrictions on who we talk to and when and why.
Yes, look, from an outsider's perspective, and I still see myself as the new person at the table in this instance, there is so much to learn. There's so many different pathways, and it's always nice to hear the people who are like yourselves who've been involved for much longer, still at that time where we're still building those connections, understanding the best way to get in. Can you share with us what you look for, who you actually work with from the stage, and also if there's any specific area that you look for, invest in, to give us a bit of a understanding on what Venrock does and who you work with?
Venrock's been in business for a very long time. We trace our roots back to the late 1960s. We actually have some folks who think we actually trace our roots back all the way to the late 1930s with an investment in an aviation company. So the firm was the venture arm of the Rockefeller family for decades, and in the early 2000s transitioned over to having a much broader LP base. But we've always had some companies that either have technology that came out of a national lab. There was always sort of this eye towards like very deep technology and a variety of different arcs of Venrock's sort of long life cycle. So we are an early stage seed and Series A investor generalist fund. So we have two core teams, a tech team and a healthcare team. And then on the thesis front, at least where I focus, and there are a couple of other investors who sort of play in this space with me as well, really focused in a couple key places. The first one is sort of this reindustrialization of America thesis. And I think the way that I think about that is production is deterrence. So strong supply chains mean strong America, and also hopefully don't end up having to go to war if we can revitalize some of these ossified industries that are critical and a critical component of the national defense. I think the second one comes from background in public safety in addition to national security. So started my career at NYPD as an intelligence analyst. And so a big part of that was exposure to the fact that a lot of the public sector, particularly in state and local, are technologically ignored. So focusing on how we can kind of build out thriving cities based on technology that we can be investing in. And then on the defense front, we're looking at a wide range. So everything from energy to kind of capability as a service to logistics to a variety of different kind of non-kinetic ways that defense is a critical component of what we do every day. Those are a couple of key areas and have been sort of ebbs and flows of focus areas of Venrock for a long time.
That's certainly a long history. And obviously now it must be nice to be able to carry that on. It's a bit more of a legacy piece. And obviously with technology moving as fast as it is, you'll continuously be evolving what you focus on. But in terms of the national security and the framing of defence, we do struggle here in Australia culturally with the how to digest defence and how to present it in such a way that it is more of that national security piece opposed to being, guns and weapons. And I'm wondering, culturally, America usually does this better. There is a different cultural appreciation for being able to defend. Whereas in Australia, there's a bit great assumption that someone's always coming to save us. We don't really know much about them. We just hope on the day when it's needed, someone's there. But in the interim, there's a lot of opinions around who works for defense, what you do, what you invest in. Are you backing companies that are building rockets and firearms? Even when we frame, putting solutions into warfighters' hands or solutions into taking the best solutions and putting them into warfighters' hands, even the framing of that can be taken the wrong way sometimes. Do you face this cultural challenge in your general conversation?
I think in the general conversation, it continues to be an underlying theme on the venture side. And frankly, like even in our own partnership, we think about it in two ways, sort of two sides of the same coin are survivability and lethality.
Yeah.
And I think we're very focused on the survivability side, and that can mean a lot of different things. I think, we'll continue to draw a line on like the true energetics, if you will. There are a bunch of companies now that are building newer, lighter 155 rounds. I think we'll stay out of the munition space for a variety of reasons, but it's definitely a continued conversation. And I think it's an important one to be having. And some venture firms feel totally fine, completely jumping into the lethality side of that spectrum. But I think there's plenty of work to be done sort of at every stage along the way. It's interesting. I don't think we've got the same cultural aversion to technology in warfighters' hands. I think that goes back to the survivability. Force protection is a really critical use case, I think, for a lot of our companies. And I think as an organization and as a firm, we're very supportive of making sure that the best technology is in the hands of the warfighters and really mean that. It's just, there's probably an earlier stop on that lethality path than there is for some other venture folks that are playing in the defense space.
No, so Morgan, building off of that and considering where you were located, September 11th is something, is a very seminal moment, in New York's history, in America's history, in the world's history. How much do you think that sort of changed the perspective of the average American as it relates to this question that Peter just asked? Just very curious. The fact that happened on American soil and we actually are now wholeheartedly investing in these types of capabilities to keep the homeland safe.
I struggle to pull that thread all the way through. And the reason why, and this is just my sort of instinct on the question, Sean, happy to go back and forth on it. I think having been in New York City on 9/11, so I'm born and raised New Yorker, was seminal to all of those different organizations, to the country in general, but also like I can trace my own sort of personal history back to 9/11. I think on that day, some of the things I remember the most were, my parents on the Upper West Side of New York City flying 4 American flags off the family minivan. There was an entire period of time in there during the Iraq War, Afghanistan drawdown, the Afghanistan withdrawal, a variety of other kind of peaks and valleys in the global war on terror that sort of get in the way of being able to totally take 9/11 and pull it all the way through. Because I think even 5 years ago, I can't remember exactly the year, I think it was 2017, Google, Maven, and aversion to supporting defense-oriented projects across Silicon Valley. I think we are a far cry from those days, and I think the pendulum has swung. I think 9/11 was a key piece for people of kind of my generation and maybe yours, Sean, but I'm still in the reserves, and a lot of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that I get to work with in that time, like they weren't alive during 9/11. And that's kind of a crazy thing that we have to contend with because that was such a seminal moment for so many people to rally together and to sort of rally behind the flag in a way that was completely nonpartisan. And I feel like we've lost that a little bit because we don't have that same shared experience in the same way. Does that make sense?
I appreciate that person. It makes complete sense. And I really appreciate the personal perspective that I wanted you to bring into this conversation because I know how vital that was as it relates to your career and how you've gone on and done some great things there. Other side of the coin on that question. So 5 years ago, it was actually 2017. You're exactly right. So what is that? 8 years ago now. I was at DIU when the whole Project Maven thing unfolded, right? And so that was actually out of the autonomy and actually the artificial intelligence and machine learning portfolio. it was really interesting because Google backed out of it. And then since that time, you have Microsoft and you actually have Amazon Web Services getting multi-billion-dollar contracts from the Department of Defense, to where now Google in the public sector is now back in this, right? So my question for you is, maybe not necessarily patriotism, but capitalism. Do you feel that that's actually more of a driving force for a lot of why these companies, especially in the Valley, are less reticent to actually embracing DoD and intelligence community use cases because the dollars are just so key if you're able to actually get on the other side of the equation?
I think that's certainly a part of it. I don't want to paint such a broad brush and say that everybody who's sort of streaming into the defense tech domain is here for purely capitalistic aims. However, when you look at what we do here as venture capitalists, there has to be, some tie to a return. And I think in this particular case, the coalescing of both the kind of investing in national security and the national interest, plus an administration that is flowing large dollar sums and have you sort of publicly created a commitment to supporting non-traditional startups in some of these major organizations, plus the fact that there has not been a super high performing asset class. I think that confluence of factors is helping to drive capital into this domain. I think one of the fears there is you get capital from folks who don't necessarily tie the capital that they're providing to the outcome that you see on the other side. I think for folks who, there are a lot of people in the space who are building for the space because they have spent some time in public service. And I think on occasion we forget as a broader defense tech community that we're talking about what it means to build a capability to go to war. And so making sure that the fact that there is this very powerful and heavy and meaningful thing that we all hope doesn't happen. Let's make sure that we don't create incentives around defense technology companies that serve the national interest that only meet valuations of a certain size if we go to war. Because that's something that nobody wants, particularly those of us who have done it in the past.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's such an interesting insight, and understanding those perspectives and the outcomes is what both the founder and also the funders are looking to collaborate and build together is super, super important, and making sure we're aligned on those outcomes. And often I'll speak at conferences and events and give a bit of a, Venture Capital 101 brief to sort of understand the journey. But a lot of founders will, and this is across the board, it's not just for defense, need to be reminded to do their own due diligence on the investors as well, to ensure that it's never just money and it's never just the investment for growth and scale. It's who is the right partner to take you to where you need to go, who has the either connections or insider experience or whatever it is you're actually searching for. And that's, for first-time founders in particular, not serial entrepreneurs or people who have been involved in various ventures before. They understand what comes with that or what doesn't come with the capital sometimes. How much do you focus at Venrock on what else you can bring in addition to the capital? And how do you convey that to founders in terms of why would you, look at us? Why would you pitch to us? What's your messaging there, and how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a couple of things. The first one is we are not new to defense tech investing, especially, I'm relatively new to the team. I'm in my second year, but there are two exceptional Venrock investors who are also in the space who were here before I was here. Nick Beim, who was a board member at Dataminr and is the reason that I am in venture capital. I'd probably only be in venture capital working alongside Nick and the Venrock team. And then Ethan Petrasky, who made a couple of early bets on space companies like Astronis and a few others. And so we have this kind of long history that I think is really helpful. We also have a very collegial firm where if I make an investment into a company, you have the support not just of me, but of every other investor who is part of our team. And so that's the kind of Venrock piece. We also only make a couple of investments every year. And so the expectation is that I am first phone call, most active investor, the person that the CEO on the other side really wants to call, good, bad, or ugly, because I can be part of that crisis response team alongside him or her. And that's how I measure. That's a really critical part of how we create really good relationships with founders that we partner with. I think the other piece is just proximity to the problem set. I think I mentioned briefly that I'm still in the reserves, and I think that's super helpful because I've walked in the shoes in many cases, not all cases, of the people who are going to end up being the recipients of some of this technology. It's the privilege of still being a relatively junior officer on the reserve side because in the venture community, for CEOs of some of these startups, depending on what their strategy is, they're oftentimes talking to a very senior level
Mm.
of people across a particular organization or agency. And that's one perspective. It's very important. But how that actually ends up helping, to your point, Peta, the warfighter who is actually going to go and execute that mission set with that unmanned system, with that next generation tactical comms set, who's wearing that? It's not a four
Exactly.
star, it's not a three
Mm.
star.
No.
It's a O3 or an O4, and it's an E6 to an E9. And like those are the people I want to talk to when
Yep.
it comes to better understanding what do we need. And so when founders pitch me, one, I can give that perspective up front. And then two, kind of help make sure that they're building the right thing for the right people and get that kind of continuous validation along the way from an operational end user, while we also kind of make sure they're working backwards from where they ultimately need to go as they walk that very long and arduous path that is getting approved to
Mm.
support the Department of Defense.
Yes, so important. We have Jake Bostock, who's on our team. He's still active in the army, which is, it's like a secret weapon that we have in terms of the insight internally, because his mandate or his thesis is he just wants his mates to survive, and the core purpose for him is to ensure that they get the best things to be able to operate and do what they need to do, and can always share that perspective. There's a lot of founders that we work with, and we see there's a lot in this space that come out of university research or research and then looking to commercialize whatever that is. So they may not be having that time internally in defence. And so then obviously getting involved with either organisations like us or other organisations, the connection piece would be who on team, or what is the pathway that we could help introduce them to understand that people are going to be wearing it, using it, driving it, or operating it is key. What sort of advice do you give to founders in terms of connecting with the end user? If it's not you internally, how do you suggest that they connect? Because that can usually be a difficult task.
I think there are a couple of different ways. I do feel like some of the organizations that are more innovation oriented are starting to get better at this. There's also, though, there's so many more companies that want to sell into defense than can actually be purchased. And
Mm.
so on occasion, I think you'll have a little bit of gatekeeping from those organizations of the operational end user because they have to, because otherwise that end user may do nothing all day long except for talk to startups. So I think a couple of things. One, like it actually doesn't matter who you end up talking to. So I think just like call friends, call family. Do you know anyone who's in the military? And
Mm.
frankly, that's probably going to get you to the right level faster than if you call a government relations firm in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Because that person who they're going to call is probably like a E6 mechanic who has a totally different and much more grounded perspective, most likely on what happens in the day-to-day of the military. So I think that's one avenue. I think there are also a variety of different types of events that are getting better at having operational folks show up. So things like the Navy's got something called the Joint Interagency Field Exercise. So this is an exercise where a whole bunch of end users actually show up and test your technology, and you can leverage it in a really meaningful way. I think the Navy, the special warfare side, has a couple of those as well. And I think the big thing is just figuring out what types of events do you want to go to fill that specific bucket. it doesn't necessarily count to me as like a go-to-market activity, but it is the thing that will make your product much better and much more likely to get picked up and to win when you ultimately start getting in front of folks on the contracting side.
So on that contracting side, Morgan, I'm glad that you actually ended that statement with that statement, because one of the things that we frequently talked about in our internal meetings is that the U.S. Department of Defense buys the best technology, that it can get on contract, right? And so if you don't know how to get on contract, you might be the best solution out there. But unless you actually have that person working in concert with the warfighter, you can talk all day long until you're blue in the face. Getting back to Peter's question, how do you recommend startups not only get that warfighter perspective, but as important, probably even more importantly, how do they go ahead and actually start that process of getting on contract, actually bringing in those dollars to where they can actually keep this thing going?
Yeah, it's such a challenging multivariable equation because you're totally right. Like that operational end user is nothing if you can't connect it to someone who owns dollars and cents. And I think that's one of the big challenges that people had. And I've seen an evolution even since I've been really focused on defense tech over the last couple of years, which is people used to think an operational end user, if they were in '06 and that '06 said, I really want your thing, that company then went into the venture capital community and said, I've got this '06. That person said they really want my thing. We've got great demand signal. I think there's a lot better understanding today that operational end user does not necessarily own the budget. And it is incumbent on you as the startup and also the partnership you've started to create with your end users to make sure that you're getting in front of the person who owns the budget and quickly. So I think I have not a ton of great advice other than the fact that I think it's a human terrain problem. And this is maybe because I'm an intelligence officer, but you've got to map the people. And there are a few great resources. I think Stanford put one out of like every single PEO across every service, where to find them, what types of problem sets. So I think that's one piece. We're also starting to see startups kind of pop up in the space. I think Prism's one of them that I've heard great things about. But I think there are many ways to figure out sort of who that PEO is, who that PM is, who ultimately will house your capability. So I think those are two pieces of the puzzle. I think there are two, maybe three others that are also equally important. One is understanding the requirements process. This is like so in the weeds and not fun for anybody, but I think figuring out which service owns a budget that is kind of tied to your capability is also helpful because you can figure out if you can align what you're building to something that has already been budgeted for. And if it's not already budgeted, it's going to be a long time. And so figuring out a variety of different pockets of funding that you can leverage to be able to cross the valley as it were. And a lot of those are UFERs and SIBRs of a variety of types and TACFI and STRATFI. And I think, this goes back to the question of, are we changing? I think DoD saw that there was this valley of death and tried to plug the hole with a whole variety of different ways to get that kind of bridge funding, but still hasn't quite finished the swing on how do we make sure that we're getting the right startups who can bridge that valley and who can align to a really critical requirement and need and can deliver on it at scale. How do we get that person to the top of the line with the PEOs? And I think that's still something that we're working on.
You were a part of an amazing panel at South by with David Rothside of Shield Capital and Chris Moran, who leads Lockheed Ventures. One of the things that we're starting to see startups do to actually get over this valley of death is to partner with someone like a David Rothside, who was Pathways over at DIU, who knows how the sausage is made from an acquisition standpoint, and Chris Moran, who brings the depth and breadth of the entirety of Lockheed that have existing contract vehicles. What are your thoughts with regards to both Venrock and other venture-backed companies pursuing collaborations with systems integrators, which sometimes might be the fastest way to revenue since they already have the contract mechanisms?
I think it's a great pathway. I think, I'll be honest, I think when I had a less active role sort of I'm not at the heart of this ecosystem, but I think there are a variety of venture firms that sort of sit within this prime startup, government, policy ecosystem and venture can kind of bridge the gap on all of them in a variety of different ways. I think when I was outside of it and I was on the startup side, I was very wary and leery of working with primes. But I've changed my tune on that. I think there's a right time and a place and a right set of problems. And I think how the contract is set up is really important. But I think you're seeing more and more startups, ride on a Palantir backbone or a Booz Allen backbone. And they're leveraging these organizations to short circuit some of the major, the very lengthy processes within DoD, things like the ATO process. What I would love instead is we fix the problem that is creating these sort of weird incentives and externalities. But in lieu of that, if it means getting better technology in the field faster, I think it can be very helpful. But I would still be a little bit wary. If I was building a startup today, it would need to be the right partnership for the right use case. And I would be very focused on making sure I was also protecting my business model while working with others in the ecosystem.
And intellectual property.
Yes.
Yes. The magic word, Sean.
Such good insight and answers, and does echo what we would assume and think anyway. So it's nice to hear you sort of share it from that perspective. I've got a couple more questions before we wrap up because all of a sudden we've used up 45 minutes. But in terms of the personality of a founder, we know, from the venture perspective, you're looking for a certain type of thing within the organization and where they're heading, what they've got, the tech, the capability, the ability to scale. In terms of the founders in particular, what do you and the team look for as some key personality traits that are a hell yes or a no for backing founders from the personality perspective, more human level?
I mean, this will come as no surprise to either of you or anyone who listens to this podcast. I think the biggest thing, and if you're building for the defense tech domain, is just grit, because it is so hard and it takes so long. And you are going to feel like you are running in place day after day. And so there's this Admiral Stockdale quote that we talk about a lot internally when we think about founders in the defense tech space, and it's all around, and I'll paraphrase it, it's all around sort of maintaining that unwavering faith that you can and will prevail in the end. And so that lends itself nicely to the fact that oftentimes the founding teams that we look for in this space have somebody who has served. It doesn't need to be the CEO, it doesn't need to be the CTO, but someone who, one of the things I love about military service is when I hire someone who comes out of the military and they say they're going to do something, they do it.
Yeah.
And they do it on time. And if they can't, then they're going to tell me. And I think, one of the critical things that, there's the kind of Stockdale piece, you've got to have that unwavering faith and commitment and desire to prevail. But trust and transparency are also essential. This is a 10-year journey. It's really hard, particularly in DoD, to have metrics along the way that help you know and understand that this company is moving in the right direction. You can't measure a defense business on monthly recurring revenue. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so how do you make sure you've got a counterparty on the other side who you trust? And then the last thing is just, I think, particularly in this space, because there is no clear Rosetta Stone, there is no super clear front door to how you engage with the Department of Defense just yet, although I think DIU is getting closer and closer. The rate of learning very much determines winners. And so having founders who can sit across from you, even in your first couple of diligence meetings, show the fact that they are continuously learning, I think is another critical piece. Also, people have spent a lot of time focusing on and defining the problem, because in this space, we look for founders that are focused on a kind of top 3 problem for a particular organization that we know has a budget associated with it. And there are a lot of people who come in with an autonomy solution or the 450th drone company. And so making sure that we are kind of finding new and novel problems that come from unique insights and unique team compositions, I think, that makes a really winning combination for our team.
And look, that echoes what we believe as well. And it's always nice to sort of hear that. I think founders really appreciate hearing it as well, but can't hear it enough before it, sinks in. And just reminders, I think having somebody on the team who's served, I think is super advantageous as well. Flipping the side a little bit in terms of yourself, day in life of somebody in venture in the middle of New York City. What does a day look like for you? Just normal life. What does it look like?
Oh man, I don't know if there's a normal day in the life. I think one of the true joys of this job, but also challenges of this job, is time is truly your most precious asset. There are unbelievable companies in this domain that I wish we could back over and over and over again. But I think, one of the challenges with coming from the operator side to the venture side is you go from making 1,000 decisions every day to making like 2 of consequence a year. And so you end up saying no a lot. And that part is really hard because so many of those founders you say no to, it's not because you don't love the company they're building or don't think they're the right person to build it. It's just not the right thing at the right time during like the right moment against the right problem set. And so I think that part makes it really hard. But how does that translate to a day in the life? I think one of the things that is really unique about this job is every 30 minutes or every hour, you could be focused on a different slice of the problem. And that part makes it really fun. And then you find a company that you fall in love with and everything else gets wiped off the calendar and you go really deep and you learn something you've never learned before. And so it is the perfect job for someone who is endlessly curious.
Good answer. Yes, look, our founder, Steve, is a very relentless person in terms of, and I've worked closely with him for many, many years and, with lots of different people around us as well. And not saying that there is one person making decisions, there's not, there's a whole group of us. But I do believe that there's this certain personality type of the way that we operate. You tend to look for the same things in the founders who are also just as relentless because you know that no matter what happens, they're going to, like you said, have the grit, have what it takes to be able to get to whatever it is that they're heading towards. So it's hard to identify that unless you also live and breathe it every day. So I do believe in all of us, we have this thing that you can sort of pick up those traits in other people and they tend to be the ones that super special or have something, like you said, learn something new or learn something that you've never even knew existed or that problem needed solving. So that's always an exciting part of it.
It's the best. And I think, the other part of that, I condensed the Stockdale quote, but the other part of it is the desire to have the discipline to confront the most brutal fact of the current reality. And I think there's a piece to that that's really important in company building because you are holding 2 kind of opposing forces at the same time, which is the fact that like you are dreaming really big because you want to change the face of an industry and that's why you want venture capital. But you also have to be clear-eyed about the current reality and bridging that gap and doing it in a way where you can also build a team of people who want to follow you. It's really tough. But thankfully, there are some amazing entrepreneurs out there who are doing it every day.
Yeah. Oh, we could talk for hours, I feel. Any plans to come to Australia anytime soon? We'd love to host you anytime you wanted to come down under.
Upon invitation, I will make my way down to Australia.
I'll have to make it at the same time when Sean comes next time, and we will definitely have a chat, have a catch up. And then also, we can always wrap an interesting event around we'd love to host you. If you are keen to come over, we'll make it happen. Won't we, Sean?
Sounds amazing. You guys have an advisor in one of my favorite strategists on planet Earth, Mick Ryan. And so I would love to come down and visit the rest of the Beaten Zone team, in addition to stopping by whatever event seems right.
Yeah, look, there's more and more, which is great. There is definitely a nice shift in focus and energy here in terms of the defence sector. We're seeing more and more people come into the space. We're seeing it become common language, and a lot more conversations around the need to come up with solutions, the need to wrap or include defence more in terms of the innovation ecosystem. And so it's only going to get better, grow, and hopefully have the type of outcomes and impact that we're looking for, which is great.
You guys are really on the front line of something that we talk about a lot on the Navy side, which is how do we make sure that Xi Jinping doesn't wake up and say, today is the day?
Yes.
Have a role to play in making sure that that day is not today and it's not tomorrow. So thanks for what you guys are doing.
No, I appreciate it. Been an amazing conversation. Thank you for making it happen, Sean.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always wonderful to talk with you both. And Morgan, thank you so much for your time and all the great work that you're doing as a part of this coalition of the willing to make sure that we all stay safe and sound.
Back at you.
Thanks for joining us in the briefing room. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with the people shaping our national security and future capability. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show, share it with a friend, and join us next time for more stories and insights from the front lines of innovation. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep building the future.